in the IPRP. I mean, I'd like to go back to the details of talking about the next steps that Norm's outlined for us in terms of actually doing that 3D propagation. I think it's absolutely appropriate and important that we meet to review the site response that we get from that. In particular, obviously, my interest in the uncertainties in those areas where we don't have a lot of constraint. So I think we have at least that ahead of us, and very much would like to work with the PUC to figure out how we can keep this group going through at least that and a wrap-up. And one of the things that, again, I think important, because we are acting on behalf of the public, that we do some kind of final meeting in San Luis Obispo County so that those who know of our work but don't follow it very quickly can hear our total conclusion.
Overall conclusion. So that's, I'm not sure that's a lot different. What I would think of be valuable for the public is not a whole lot different from certainly different tone and style of presentation than what was presented at the Seismological Society, where there were discussions of most of the AB 1632 studies, what the results of those were, and then the basic summary of what the IPRP concluded of those. And so there was
reprise that maybe,
and there was some of that, and I think that was the overall that was I'm not sure that the public is going to immediately grasp the tornado diagram, but it is a way of saying here's a priority list of projects, and we thought about how you would prioritize things.
I think there's a very interesting exercise to try to communicate to the public the substance of what we've dealt with, and that's going to take some thinking, I think.
Well, and just communicating to the public what turns out to make a big difference in seismic hazard analysis as it's currently done, and factor it's there, analytical and empirical. The site factor turns out to be one of the big deals, and understanding what the basis of that is, and understanding that it's not something else that.
So it's like you said, the studies are wrapping up, and help us develop an understanding of the continued need for the IPRP, what the IPRP would do, and then we will look into the CPUC processes and see how we can, make something happen if there is a real need for it. We will need your help.
So AB 1632 was a concentrated series of studies that were designed to be 3D seismic studies and other advanced techniques. I think it's from the AB 1632 report, to study the faults in the Diablo Canyon area and to understand the uncertainty in seismic hazard. So I think there was a lot of new data about the faults, the potential earthquakes on those faults, and how that information about the faults feeds into the seismic hazard analysis. And so that aspect, I think, those concentrated studies, I think, are kind of reasonably concluded. We can say they did what they were asked. They did 3D seismic studies. They learned a lot about faults.
In some places more than others.
And some things that some things didn't work out. And of course, the high energy seismic didn't happen at all. But as a whole, there was a lot learned about the faults and their potential for earthquakes. We got into the 3D model of the Irish Hills in general, and then the immediate area of the plant. We had a lot of skepticism within the IPRP about how well constrained some of that was. And then in both reports 6 and 9, we expressed a lot of skepticism about whether they can actually separate out a site factor, their empirical site factor, which is on the graph on the screen there, from what might be a path effect. Because both San Simeon and Parkfield are moderate earthquakes that are kind of from the same direction. That filtering out of some of the high frequency shaking could be due to the structure in between those earthquakes and the plant rather than in the immediate area of the plant. And this is classing it as the immediate area of the plant. What we've heard today is there's a separate way of going through this based on a different earthquake at Diablo Canyon, where you get kappa from that, you do analytical models, you end up with amplification factors that are quite similar. So those two different approaches giving you the same answer is relatively reassuring, although we need to go through both of them to understand the both and the weaknesses of both. There's still a lot to learn, as Norm said, about the details of the source differences, all the potential earthquake sources around the plant, and particularly path effects, how the seismic waves get to the plant. And so I think some of that, the details of the 3D velocity model, meaning the velocity, meaning how the seismic waves reach the plant, how you understand all of that, how that affects the seismic waves as they go from all the potential sources to the plant site. Whether, when we're looking at this and saying that could be a path effect, then you say, well, okay, maybe you're damping out this high frequency shaking on earthquakes on one side, but you wouldn't do the same for earthquakes on the other. You don't know what they would do. And so understanding the 3D velocity model and then constraining with recordings of earthquakes from an array near the plant, both path effects and source effects and site effects. This research program, which PG&E is working on in cooperation with SCEC, is something that it's going in the right direction. It's working to learn the right things, but they don't have a review panel except the ones that they have that they have on staff or consultants to PG&E. If there should be a state agency review of that, or a public review of that, that's something the IPRP could be involved in.
Yeah, so I'll leave my email. I don't think I signed in on the sheet yet. You're welcome to give me your thoughts on this. What the IPRP's role could be going forward, and what why it's important to keep it going.
John had a comment.
In terms of your past work, I think there are 3 areas that do deserve some follow-up before you get to that wrap-up session at San Luis Obispo. One, Chris mentioned that the disagreements that you had about the Irish Hills at, I think, your December meeting, might have been November meeting. But if you'll recall, you did not see any basis for distinguishing what at that point in CSIP was presented as one preferred model versus a couple of others that Dr. Thompson presented. And you were assured eventually that when it got to the Shack report, those 3 models would each be equally weighted. In fact, PG&E told the public that that was one of the primary measures of the influence that the IPRP had was that based on your reaction, those 3 models were equally weighted. Well, turns out they weren't. Rather than a 33, 33, 33, PG&E chose in the Shack report to do a 40, 40, 20. Disturbingly, from the standpoint of my client's perspective, the one that got the 20% short straw was the one that had the largest impact on the hazard at the plant. Second area that I would suggest deserves your follow-up has to do with joint rupture analysis. You'll recall from the NRC's research information letter back in 2012, there was no prospect seen for the shoreline fault joint rupturing with the Hosgri. As it turned out, because of the work, the AB 1632 studies, that conclusion was changed, and PG&E modeled joint rupture scenarios. In fact, in your report number 9, you've got one graph toward the end of the report that shows a joint rupture of the Hosgri, San Simeon, and shoreline, producing ground motions in excess of the 1977 Hosgri spectrum. Well, in early 2014, during the middle of that period when you and PG&E weren't communicating very closely, PG&E embarked upon a joint rupture analysis that would take the Hosgri fault all the way up to the Mendocino Triple Junction, and they evaluated that configuration of the Hosgri jointly rupturing with the shoreline, that configuration of the Hosgri jointly rupturing with the Los Osos, and that configuration of the Hosgri jointly rupturing with the San Luis Bay faults. These were deterministic analyses. It turned out they assigned a magnitude 8.0 to each of those joint rupture scenarios. And I think if you were to graph the ground motion of those joint ruptures in the same way in which you did the Hosgri-San Simeon joint rupture with the shoreline, you'd find an even greater exceedance of the 1977 Hosgri spectrum. And the third area is an admission that PG&E has made to the Alliance in their testimony in a current proceeding at the PUC, that in their view, and they do feel that it is a reflection of the scientific consensus, that ground motion, and they tend to focus on PGA as a major ground motion, saturates at earthquakes magnitude 6.5. And if you look in the literature, there's some that think that that saturation occurs at 6.0, some that think that occurs at 7.0. But in fact, that effectively immunizes the plant from at least low frequency ground motions from earthquakes above magnitude 6.5. I think you need to determine whether you agree with that, what weight you think ought to be put on longer period motions that some think actually correlate with increases of magnitude, and how you think the public should look at the risk posed by earthquakes at the plant in excess of a magnitude 6.5.
That last is actually wraps up a lot of different aspects of seismic hazard analysis, and what are the important parameters, and what is the procedure for doing that. And so I think that's something that we can certainly talk about. I think that's